She walked through the restaurant door every morning before the sun had fully risen. The smell of fresh bread and coffee always filled the air, and she would quietly tie her apron and start arranging the tables. She never made noise, never drew attention. She simply worked with calmness that made her different from the others. The restaurant was not very large, but it was elegant. Soft lights, wooden tables, and a shining grand piano stood in one corner as if waiting for someone to touch it. She always looked at that piano with quiet eyes. Every time she passed it, she wiped its surface gently with a cloth, making sure no dust stayed on it. She treated it like something alive, something she respected deeply. She never told anyone that she had once played piano. She just worked her long hours taking orders, cleaning tables, and serving food while people came and went around her. To most customers, she was invisible, just another waitress with polite smiles and quick steps. She did not mind because she had learned to live quietly and not expect anyone to notice her. She had learned that life was easier when you blended into the background. But deep inside, she carried something she never showed anyone, a secret that lived in her hands and heart, a secret that once filled her world with music. When she was little, she used to sit beside her father while he repaired old pianos. He was a piano tuner in a small town, and he loved music. More than anything, he never had much money, but he had love and patience, and he taught her how to listen to sounds, how to feel when a key was slightly off, how to close her eyes and find the right note. She used to sit for hours pressing the keys while he smiled and said again, "Listen again." She learned fast, and soon she could play simple songs without looking at any paper. Her father said she had a gift that came from her soul. But things changed when he got sick. Their small home could not carry the cost of medicine, and she had to stop school to help. Her mother, after he passed away, she never touched a piano again. She could not. It hurt too much to see one and remember how he smiled. So she moved to the city, took small jobs, and ended up at this restaurant, cleaning tables and serving food where a piano stood like a ghost of her past. Every day she passed it, every night she looked at it when no one was watching, and sometimes her fingers would move in the air as if pressing invisible keys. She remembered the songs she used to play. She remembered how her father's hands guided hers. She remembered the feeling of sound flowing like light in her chest. She missed it, but she had promised herself not to dream again, because dreams made life harder when you were poor. She only wanted to survive. One night when the restaurant had closed and the others had left, she stayed behind to clean the floor. The lights were dim and rain tapped softly on the window. The piano stood quietly in the corner, shining in the soft light. She looked at it for a long moment, her heart beating fast. Then she walked slowly toward it, her hands shaking. She sat down and touched the keys lightly. Just one touch, the sound was soft, clear and warm. It felt alive. She closed her eyes and pressed another key. Then, another. Soon a melody came without her meaning to play it. Her fingers remembered what her heart had forgotten. The notes flowed like whispers, filling the empty room. She smiled for the first time in months. Her eyes filled with tears. She played one of her father's songs, a tune he used to hum while working. It was sad but beautiful. She did not notice the time passing. She played until her hands trembled when she finally stopped. She sat there quietly, listening to the echo fade away. She whispered, "Thank you, Papa," and wiped her eyes. The next morning, everything was back to normal. The restaurant was busy. People laughed, talked, ate, and left like every other day. But something inside her had changed. She felt lighter, freer, as if a door had opened in her chest and air had come rushing in. But she still did not tell anyone about it. She kept her secret carefully, as if it was something fragile and sacred. She still looked at the piano every day, but now it was not pain. She felt it was comfort. One afternoon, a coworker named Linda noticed how she looked at the piano. She asked, "Have you ever played it?" And the waitress smiled shyly and said, "Once, long ago." Linda laughed. "You look like you miss it." She did not answer. She only smiled and walked away. That night after work, she played again, softly, quietly, thinking no one would ever hear her, but someone did. The night guard came early to check the locks and stopped outside the dining room when he heard the music. He stood still, listening, not wanting to disturb her. When she stopped and saw him, he just smiled and said, "You play beautiful." She blushed and said, "Please don't tell anyone." He nodded and promised from that night he often listened from the hallway without saying a word. It became her little secret moment of peace. A few weeks passed and she kept working as usual. But sometimes during her break, she sat near the piano just to touch the keys once or twice. Even that made her heart warm. She started humming small tunes while cleaning tables. A quiet joy began to grow inside her. Though she still hid it from everyone, she started to believe again that maybe music had not left her. Maybe it had just been waiting. She began saving a few coins every week, dreaming that one day she could buy a small keyboard to play at home. She did not tell anyone because people might laugh at her for dreaming. She was a waitress after all. What right did she have to dream of music again? But deep inside, she knew she could not silence her heart forever. One evening when the restaurant was closing and the lights were low, she saw a man looking at the piano. He was a customer who came often, kind and quiet with silver hair. He asked her, "Do they ever play this?" She said, "No, sir, not anymore." He smiled and said, "That is a shame, such a beautiful instrument to stay silent." She nodded and said softly, "Sometimes silence hides beautiful sounds." The man looked at her, surprised by her words, but before he could say more, the manager called him away. She did not know then that this small moment would soon change everything for her. That man was not just a customer. He was a retired music professor, but she had no idea. She simply went on working, smiling softly when she looked at the piano, thinking of her father and of all the music still hiding inside her, waiting for the right moment to be heard again. And though no one else noticed her, as she walked quietly among the tables, her secret gift was alive, and it was only a matter of time before the world found out. She was born in a small town where houses were close together and the streets were quiet. Most of the time, her father worked as a piano tuner, and everyone in town knew him for his gentle hands and warm smile. Their house was small and old, but it was filled with music all the time. Her father used to say that music could heal everything, and that even on sad days, a single tune could make life brighter. She believed him because whenever he played, she forgot all worries. Her mother used to hum while cooking, and sometimes they sang together after dinner. Her father had an old piano that was slightly broken. Some keys were sticky, and some strings made strange sounds, but he said it had a soul, and it was his favorite. He would sit beside it for hours, fixing and tuning it, and she would sit next to him, watching and listening. One day, when she was about 6, he lifted her up and placed her on the chair and said, "Try a note." She pressed a key and the sound made her giggle. Then he told her to press another, and soon he showed her how to play simple songs. She learned quickly, her small fingers moving carefully over the keys. Her father was proud of her and told everyone, "My little girl will one day make music that people will never forget." She used to blush and hide behind him, but inside she felt happy. Those were the happiest years of her life. Mornings were filled with school and evenings with music. Sometimes her father took her to houses where he worked, and she waited quietly while he fixed pianos. After he finished, he let her play for a few minutes, and the people always smiled and said she had a gift. She dreamed of learning more, maybe joining a music school one day, but life had other plans. When she turned 12, her father started coughing a lot and often got tired. He said it was nothing, but soon he could not work. As before, money became short, and her mother started doing laundry for other families to help. One night, she woke up to the sound of her parents talking quietly. Her mother's voice was worried. She said, "We cannot afford the doctor," and her father said, "I will be fine. I just need rest." But he was not fine. His health got worse, and the sound of music slowly disappeared from the house. She tried to keep playing for him, but he could no longer sit by her side. His hands shook too much. One day he called her close and placed her small hands in his. He said, "Promise me you will never stop playing no matter what happens." She nodded with tears in her eyes. She did not understand then that he was saying goodbye. A few weeks later he passed away, and their small world broke into pieces. After that, nothing felt the same. The piano stood silent in the corner, covered with dust. Her mother cried every night, and she stopped playing because every note reminded her of him. They had to sell the piano to pay for rent and food. She watched strangers carry it away, and it felt like they were taking a part of her heart too. She was only 13, but she decided to be strong for her mother. She left school and started working in a local shop, then later in a bakery. She smiled for customers and said polite words, but inside she felt empty. She still remembered the promise she made to her father, but life was too heavy. She did not have time or strength to dream. About music, years passed quietly like that. She grew older. Her hands became rough from work, but her fingers still remembered the feeling of keys under them. Sometimes at night she would draw small piano keys on paper and pretend to play closing. Her eyes and hearing the sound in her head, she missed her father's voice saying, "Listen again." She missed the sound of laughter and the smell of polish he used for his tools. When she turned 19, her mother fell sick too, and she took care of her. The small town no longer had enough work, so she decided to move to the city to earn more. She promised her mother she would send money every month, and then she left with a small bag and a photo of her parents. The city was big, noisy, and fast she felt lost in it. The buildings were tall and the streets full of people who never looked at each other. She found a small room to rent and searched for jobs. Finally, she got one in a restaurant as a cleaner. Then later as a waitress. It was hard work, but it paid enough for food and rent. She missed home, but she knew she had to stay. She sent money to her mother every month and wrote letters, though the letters often came back late. The restaurant was fancy with shiny floors and soft lights, and in one corner stood a grand piano that no one played the first time she saw it. Her heart stopped for a second. She wanted to touch it, but she was afraid she only looked at it from far away. Remembering her father, that piano became her silent friend. She always cleaned it carefully, and sometimes when no one was watching, she touched one key softly, just to hear a single note. It felt like meeting an old friend, but she never dared to play more. She thought she had no right to anymore. She was just a waitress. Her life was about work and paying bills, not about dreams. People in the restaurant barely noticed her. They were busy with their meals, their laughter, their lives. She smiled, served them, and disappeared quietly from their thoughts. At night, when she went back to her small room, she often sat by the window and listened to street musicians playing guitars and violins. She wanted to go to them to say, "Can I play too?" But fear always stopped her. She thought, what if she had forgotten how? What if her fingers no longer worked like before? She told herself it did not matter. She had work to do. Dreams were for people who had time and money, not for waitresses, but deep inside her heart, never accepted that it kept whispering to her, especially when she saw the piano shining under the restaurant lights one rainy evening, when business was slow and the streets outside were empty. She stood near the piano longer than usual. Her co-worker Linda asked, "Why do you always stare at it?" She smiled and said, "It reminds me of my father." Linda said, "You play, don't you?" She shook her head and said, "Not anymore." Linda laughed softly. Once a player, always a player. She did not answer, but inside she knew Linda was right. Music never left her. It only slept somewhere deep, waiting for her to wake it up. She went home that night thinking about her father, about his words, about the promise she had broken. And the next evening, after everyone had gone home, she finally sat at the piano and played again. Her hands shook at first, but when the first note came out clear and warm, she closed her eyes and felt his presence beside her. She played softly, afraid someone might hear, but she could not stop. Her soul was speaking again, and even if no one else was listening, she felt alive for the first time in years. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "I did not forget, Papa. I just got lost. I am back now." She played until her hands were tired, then quietly stood up and wiped the piano clean again, as if saying thank you. She did not know that this small act, this quiet moment, would soon lead her toward a life she never imagined. Her father's promise had found its way back to her heart, and even though she still wore the same apron and carried trays from table to table, something inside her had changed forever, because music, once awakened, never truly dies. It waits silently for the right touch, the right moment, and the right courage to be heard again. The restaurant was brighter than usual that day. There was an important private dinner planned for a group of wealthy guests, and everyone was rushing to make things perfect. She moved quietly between the tables, polishing glasses, arranging napkins, and making sure every candle was placed right. The piano stood in its usual corner, shining under the soft light. It had been cleaned and polished because the manager wanted everything to look elegant. She looked at it for a moment, her heart giving a small ache, but then she went back to work, pretending not to care. By evening, the guests started arriving, men in dark suits, women in elegant dresses. Laughter filled the room and music from the speakers played softly in the background. One of the guests was an older man with kind eyes and white hair. He walked slowly using a cane and spoke politely to everyone. He was a retired music professor, but no one in the restaurant knew that. Not even the manager. He loved music and always noticed details others ignored as he took his seat near the piano. He smiled and said, "It's beautiful. Does someone play it?" The manager laughed and said, "Not really, sir. It's mostly for decoration." The professor looked surprised and said, "Such a lovely instrument shouldn't." "Stay silent." The manager shrugged. "We had a pianist once, but it cost too much now. We just keep it for the atmosphere." She heard the conversation from a distance and felt her heart twist. She wished she could walk up and say, "I can play," but fear held her back. She carried trays, poured drinks, smiled, and pretended not to listen. Later in the evening, one of the guests suggested having some live music. He said, "This dinner deserves something special. Maybe someone here can play the piano." The others laughed, thinking it was a joke. The manager looked uncomfortable and whispered, "Our pianist canceled last year and we never hired again." The professor smiled kindly and said, "Maybe someone among the staff knows how to play." There was silence for a moment. Then Linda spoke from the corner. "She does." She pointed toward the waitress, who froze in place. Everyone turned to look at her. Her heart started beating fast. She shook her head quickly. No, I can't." The manager frowned and said, "Have you ever played?" She whispered softly. "Yes, but a long time ago." The professor leaned forward, curious. "What did you play, my dear?" She answered quietly, "My father taught me when I was a child." The room was silent for a moment. Then the professor smiled and said, "Music never leaves the heart. Once you learn it, it stays forever." The guests began to encourage her, saying, "Come on, play something simple. We would love to hear it." She felt her cheeks burn. She wanted to say no. She wanted to run. But Linda whispered, "Softly, you can do it, just one song." She looked at the piano, her fingers trembling. It had been so long since she played in front of anyone. She slowly walked toward it. Every step felt heavy, her legs shaking. She sat down on the bench, her hands resting. Above the keys, the whole room went quiet. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, remembering her father's words. "Listen again." She pressed the first key softly. The sound was clear and gentle. Then another, and another. Soon a melody began to form. She played one of her father's old songs, the one she played that night alone after closing it. Started slow, unsure, but then her hands found their rhythm. The notes filled the room, floating like soft light. The guests stopped talking. Forks and glasses froze in midair. The music carried warmth, sadness, and hope all at once. Her fingers moved faster, her eyes half closed, lost in the sound. The professor watched her closely, his face full of wonder. He had heard many students in his life, but there was something different about her playing. It was pure, honest, and full of feeling, as if she was telling her life story through the keys. When the final note lingered in the air, the room stayed silent for a few seconds. Then applause broke out loud and strong. People stood up, clapping, cheering. Some even wiped their eyes. She sat still, stunned, not knowing what to do. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she bowed slightly. The professor walked toward her and said quietly, "My dear, that was beautiful. Where did you learn to play?" She answered softly, "My father taught me at home. We didn't have money for lessons." He smiled. I could feel love in every note. He looked at the manager and said, "You have a treasure here, don't hide her." The manager, still surprised, said, "I had no idea she could play." She looked down, embarrassed, and whispered, "I'm sorry if I shouldn't have." He shook his head. "No, don't ever apologize for something so beautiful." The professor asked her, "Do you still practice?" She said, "Not really, only sometimes when no one is here." He smiled. "Would you let me visit you again to hear more?" She nodded shyly. After the guests left, the restaurant was filled with a new kind of silence, a warm one. Linda ran to her and hugged her, saying, "You were amazing." She laughed and said, "I can't believe I did that." The manager smiled too for the first time, proud, and told her you should play more often. Maybe during weekends people would love it. She felt shy but happy. Her heart felt light that night. She walked home under the soft streetlights. The city seemed different. The noise softer, the air warmer. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Papa." She knew he would have been proud of her at home. She sat by the window thinking about what had happened. She still couldn't believe it. People had listened, really listened, and for those few minutes she wasn't just a waitress. She was a musician again. The next day, when she came to work, her co-workers clapped and teased her kindly, calling her the piano girl. She blushed and laughed, saying, "Please stop." But deep inside she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Later that week, the professor returned to the restaurant during a quiet afternoon. She was cleaning tables when she saw him enter. He smiled and said, "I hoped you would be here. I haven't stopped thinking about your music." Since that night she felt shy but happy. He sat down and asked, "May I hear you again?" She hesitated but then nodded. She sat at the piano and played a soft tune this time. Without fear, the sound filled the empty room like sunlight through a window. When she finished, he clapped gently and said, "You have a gift that is very rare. Have you ever thought of studying music?" She shook her head. "No, I could never afford that." He smiled. "I can help you if you want." She looked at him, surprised. "You would do that?" He said yes, because true music like yours deserves to be heard. She did not know what to say. Her eyes filled with tears and she whispered, "Thank you, sir." He told her, "I will arrange something. Come by the academy tomorrow and we will see what we can do." She nodded slowly, hardly believing his words. After he left, she sat at the piano for a long time, touching the keys softly. She smiled, thinking, maybe this was the beginning of something she had once believed was impossible. Her secret had finally been seen, not by chance but by destiny. And though she still wore her apron and still served tables inside, she felt as if she had already stepped into a new world, one where her father's dream was still alive, waiting for her to play it to the end. The next morning she woke up early, even before the alarm rang. Her heart was full of nervous excitement. She kept thinking about what the professor had said the night before. The sound of his gentle voice echoed in her mind. "You have a gift that deserves to be heard." She could hardly believe that someone like him had noticed her, someone who had listened to many great musicians and students. She spent the morning getting ready, carefully brushing her hair, and wearing her cleanest dress. She looked in the small mirror on her wall and whispered to herself, "You can do this." Then she walked to the music academy. It was a big old building with tall windows and quiet hallways. She felt small as she entered, but the professor was waiting for her at the door. He smiled warmly and said, "I'm so happy you came. Come, I will introduce you to some people inside." They walked through the hallway, and she could hear soft music coming from one of the rooms. Young students were practicing different instruments, and the air was filled with melodies. She looked around in wonder. It felt like a dream. The professor introduced her to another teacher, a kind woman named Miss Clara, who smiled and asked, "Have you ever studied music before?" She shook her head. "No, never, only with my father." Miss Clara nodded. "That is beautiful." She said, "People who learn with love play from the heart." The professor asked her to sit at one of the pianos and play something. She took a deep breath and sat down. Her hands trembled a little, but when she touched the keys, everything else disappeared. She played a simple melody, one that her father had taught her long ago. The room grew silent. Miss Clara looked at her with wide eyes, and the professor just smiled proudly. When she finished, they both clapped softly. The professor said, "See, I told you she is special." Miss Clara said, "She has something pure in her playing, something we cannot teach. It comes from inside." They talked quietly for a while. Then the professor turned to her and said, "How would you feel about learning here?" She looked surprised. "I could not afford it, sir." He smiled. "Do not worry about that. I will take care of it. You only need to promise that you will practice and never stop playing." She felt tears in her eyes and said, "I promise, sir, I will never stop." He nodded and said, "Good, then we start tomorrow." She walked out of the academy that day, feeling like she was walking on air. The world looked brighter. The city noises sounded. Like music, she could not wait to tell Linda and the others at work when she arrived at the restaurant. Linda hugged her tightly and said, "I knew something good would happen. You deserve it." The manager smiled, too proud of her. For the first time, she felt seen, like she mattered not just as a worker but as a person. Days turned into weeks and she began her lessons. She worked at the restaurant during the day and went to the academy in the evenings. It was not easy. She often felt tired, but she loved every minute of it. She learned new techniques, practiced every night, and slowly started believing in herself again. The professor guided her with patience. He said to her, "Once you have a rare ability, you play not for fame, but for feeling every note you touch tells a story. Remember that." And she never forgot those words. One afternoon, Miss Clara told her, "There is a small music event happening next week. Students will perform short pieces. Would you like to play?" She froze for a moment, fear returning. "What if I make a mistake?" she said softly. Miss Clara smiled. "Everyone makes mistakes, dear. That is part of music. What matters is that you play with your heart." The professor agreed, saying, "People need to hear you." She finally said, "Yes," though. She was nervous every day after that. She practiced until her fingers hurt. At the restaurant, she still worked as before, serving guests, cleaning tables. But now her eyes carried a spark. She moved with quiet confidence. Even the customers noticed and asked her why she always seemed happy. She just smiled and said nothing. When the evening of the event arrived, she stood backstage watching the other students perform. They were confident and graceful. She felt small again, like she did not belong. There, her hands trembled as she waited for her turn. The professor came to her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "Remember your father's words. Let the music speak for you." She nodded slowly when her name was called. She walked to the stage, her heart pounding. The lights were bright and she could barely see the faces in the audience. She sat down at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. At first the notes were soft and unsure, but soon they found their rhythm. She closed her eyes and let her hands move on their own. She played the same song she had played in the restaurant that night, the song her father used to hum. The sound filled the hall, rising and falling like waves. The audience leaned forward, listening. The professor watched with pride. Every note seemed to tell a story of loss, hope, and love. When she finished, the hall was silent for a moment. Then applause erupted. People stood up, clapping, cheering. Some even whistled. She looked up, her eyes wide, with surprise and tears. She stood and bowed, her heart beating fast. She had never felt such joy, such peace afterward. The professor said quietly, "I knew they would love you." She smiled through her tears and said, "I just played for him." He smiled and said, "I know." The story of the waitress pianist spread quickly. The next morning, students and teachers at the academy talked about her performance. Some called her the girl who played from the soul. The restaurant also became busier. More people came, not for the food but to see her. They asked if she would play during dinner sometimes, and though she was shy, she agreed. One weekend evening, she played softly as people ate. The guests listened quietly, the lights dim, the air filled with soft notes. When she finished, people clapped and asked for more. She smiled shyly and said, maybe next time. After that night, she was no longer just a waitress. She was someone special, yet she stayed humble. She still cleaned tables, helped others, and thanked the manager for giving her a chance. She never forgot where she came from. One night after closing, the professor came to visit again. He said, "I have something to tell you. There is a concert next month. Many talented musicians will perform. I want you to play there too." She looked shocked. "Me, sir?" He nodded. "Yes, you are ready. It will be your moment to show the world what I already know." She hesitated, afraid, but he said, "Trust yourself. Music is your truth." She agreed, though. Deep inside, she was scared, but she knew this was the chance of a lifetime. Every evening after work, she practiced for hours. Sometimes she fell asleep at the piano, waking up to find the sun rising, her fingers sore but her heart strong. Linda and the other staff supported her, cheering her on, saying, "We believe in you." When the night of the concert finally arrived, she stood backstage once again. Nervous but ready, she looked at the piano, waiting in the light, and whispered softly to herself, "I will play for you, Papa." When she walked on stage, the audience fell silent. She sat down, her hands hovering above the keys, and then she began to play. Her heart poured out in every note, each sound telling her story, from the small town to the restaurant to the day she was heard for the first time. It was not just music. It was her life unfolding before everyone. And when the last note faded away, there was silence, and then a thunder of applause. People stood up, clapping, shouting bravo. Tears ran down her face as she bowed deeply. The professor smiled proudly from the front row, knowing that she had finally found her place. She was no longer the hidden pianist. She was a voice the world had finally heard. And though she still felt like the same girl, inside she now knew her music could reach hearts just like her father said it would. After that concert, everything around her started to change, though she herself stayed the same. She still walked the same streets to work, still tied the same apron, and still smiled at the same customers, but people began to look at her differently. They no longer saw only a quiet waitress. They saw someone special, someone who had touched their hearts through music. The restaurant became busier than ever. New faces arrived every evening, asking if the girl from the concert played there. The manager at first did not understand what was happening until one customer showed him a small article in the local newspaper. It said, "A hidden pianist discovered in a small restaurant plays from the heart." It had her picture taken during the concert, though she had not noticed anyone taking it when she saw it. She felt both happy and shy. She did not think she deserved all that attention. She only played because she loved music, but now people came just to listen to her play. The manager smiled proudly and said, "We are lucky to have you here." She thanked him politely and continued to do her work with the same humility as before. But every night when the restaurant got quiet, she sat at the piano and played something soft, something that reminded her of her father and her journey. One night while she was playing, a man from a local music company happened to be dining there. He listened silently, and after she finished, he came to her and introduced himself. He said, "I would like to record your music. It deserves to be shared." She was surprised and said, "I am not a professional." He smiled. "You play with feeling, that is all that matters." She was unsure and said, "I need to ask my teacher first." The next day, she went to see the professor and told him about the offer. He listened carefully and said, "If it feels right in your heart, then do it, but remember, always stay true to who you are." She nodded. She trusted him completely. A week later, she recorded a few simple pieces in a small studio. She did not know what would come of it. She only wanted to play something that would make people feel calm and loved. When the recordings were released online, people began to share them. They said her music brought peace and emotion. People who had never seen her started writing messages, saying how her melodies made them cry or smile. She could not believe that her music was touching people she had never met. It felt like a dream, but she remained humble. She kept working at the restaurant because she did not want to forget where she started. Linda often teased her, saying, "You are famous now and you still serve soup?" She laughed and said, "This place gave me my first chance. I will never forget it." The professor continued to guide her, helping her grow and understand more about music. He told her that talent without kindness loses its beauty, and she carried those words with her everywhere she went. One afternoon, she received an invitation to perform at a bigger concert in another city. She was scared at first, but the professor said, "This is the next step for you." She agreed and began to practice day and night. When the day of the concert arrived, she looked at the large stage and the crowd that filled the hall. Her hands trembled. But when she sat at the piano, she remembered the small restaurant, the smell of coffee, the sound of laughter, and her father's voice in her heart. She began to play, and the music flowed like a river, strong and free. When she finished, the audience stood and clapped for a long time. She bowed deeply, her eyes full of tears. Afterward, reporters came asking questions, but she answered softly, saying, "I am just someone who loves music." Her words touched people because she meant them truly. Her music spread even more after that. Her recordings were played on the radio. People wrote about her story, how a waitress became a pianist through courage and hope. But she never let fame change her. She still visited the restaurant and sometimes played there quietly for old customers who remembered her first nights behind the counter. One evening after a long day, she sat alone in the restaurant long after everyone had left. She looked at the piano and thought about everything that had happened. It all felt unreal. She remembered the small house where she grew up. Her father's tired hands tuning pianos, her mother humming in the kitchen. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Papa. I hope you are hearing me now." She touched the keys gently and played the first song she ever learned. It was simple, pure, and full of love as she played. She smiled through her tears because she knew that every note was a bridge between her past and her present. Her story began to inspire others. People who had once given up on their dreams started to try again. They wrote to her saying, "Your story gave me hope." She never thought she could change lives with her music. But now she realized that sometimes sharing a piece of your heart helps others find theirs too. One day a journalist asked her what success means to you. She thought for a moment and said, "Success is not about being known. It is about staying true to who you are even when no one is watching." She meant every word because she had learned that the most beautiful music comes from honesty and kindness. She continued to play at concerts, sometimes small, sometimes big, each time giving her heart fully to the piano. But she never stopped being thankful for the people who believed in her. The professor who saw her gift, the friend who encouraged her, the manager who gave her a chance, and her father whose love started it all. She often said to the professor, "I still feel like that waitress." He would smile and reply, "Good. Never stop feeling like her because that is where your soul lives." And she smiled, knowing he was right. One evening she received a letter from a music school in another country inviting her to perform and teach. For a short time, it felt like another dream come true. She accepted. But before leaving, she went to the restaurant one last time before her trip. The lights were dim and the air smelled of coffee and rain. She sat at the piano and played softly, the same song she played the night the professor first heard her. Linda watched quietly from the door, tears in her eyes when she finished. Linda clapped softly and said, "Don't forget us." She smiled and said, "Never, I will come back always." She closed the piano gently and whispered, "Thank you" to it as if it was a living friend, because in her heart it truly was. On the day of her flight, she carried only a small bag and her father's picture. She looked out of the window of the bus as the city passed by and thought about how far she had come. She had once been a girl, cleaning tables, dreaming in silence, and now she was going to play music for people across the world. But she still felt like the same person, humble, thankful, and full of love. She knew that no matter how far she went, she would always carry her father's voice in her heart, saying, "Play with love." And that was exactly what she planned to do. The plane landed in the new country and she felt nervous but excited. She had never been so far from home before. The air felt different and the people spoke in accents she was not used to, but music was the same everywhere. It did not need translation. She was invited to perform at a grand concert hall where some of the most talented musicians had once played. When she first saw the huge piano standing on the stage, her hands trembled a little. She could not believe that a simple waitress from a small restaurant was now going to perform in such a place. She remembered the first time she had touched an old piano in her father's shop. She smiled softly, thinking how life had brought her here after so many years. She practiced every day for hours, sometimes forgetting to eat or rest. She wanted to give her best because she knew this chance might never come again. People at the music school were kind. They admired her modesty and her quiet way. She never showed off. She listened and learned from everyone. Her gentle nature made her loved by all. One of the senior musicians said to her, "Your music feels like it is speaking to my heart." She thanked him with a shy smile. On the day of the concert, the hall was full. There were lights shining down on the stage and people talking softly, waiting for the show to begin. When her name was announced, the audience went silent. She walked slowly to the piano, her heart beating fast. She sat down, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. For a moment, she saw her father's face in her mind, his hands guiding hers on the keys, his voice saying, "Play from your heart." She placed her fingers gently on the piano and began to play. The first note was soft like a whisper. Then the melody grew and filled the hall. It was full of emotion and life. Her fingers moved gracefully across the keys, each sound carrying a story of her journey from the small restaurant to this grand stage. People watched in silence. Some even had tears in their eyes because the music was not just beautiful, it was real. It carried her soul within it. When she reached the final note, the sound lingered in the air for a moment. Then the hall exploded with applause. People stood and clapped, their hands shouting bravo. She bowed deeply, her eyes shining with tears. She did not expect such love. It was more than she had ever dreamed after the concert. Many people came to meet her. They told her how her music made them feel peaceful and alive. She thanked everyone with humble words. Later that night, she sat alone in her small hotel room, looking at the city lights outside the window. She felt grateful for everything she thought of the restaurant, of the professor, of Linda, and of her father. She wished he could have been there to see her, but deep down she knew he was watching from above. She whispered softly, "I did it, Papa, for you and for all your dreams." She looked at her hands and smiled. These were the same hands that once served food and cleaned tables. Now they made music that touched hearts. It felt like a miracle. The next morning she received a letter from the music school offering her a position to teach piano to young students. She read it slowly and smiled. She had always wanted to help others find their love for music, just like her father helped her. She accepted the offer and began teaching soon. Her class became popular. Students loved her because she taught with patience and care. She told them that music was not just about notes, it was about feelings, about sharing what words could not say. She often told them the story of her journey, not to show pride but to give them hope. She said, "Never stop believing in your dreams, even I,